Good afternoon. We'd like to convene the Single Family Design Board meeting for July 17th, 2023. We'll start with a roll call, please.
Chair Kalas,
Here.
Vice Chair Anderson,
Here.
Board Member Garfighty,
Here.
Board Member Lewis,
Here.
Board Member Sherry.
Here.
We have a quorum. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll start with item A. This is an opportunity for anybody in the public who would like to address our board in a matter that is related to our purview to do so. We do not take items that are on our agenda as part of this general public comment, so this is anything else that is not on the agenda that is under the purview of the board. I'll turn it over to staff so that they can ask everybody if they've got any comments.
Thank you, Chair Kalas. I'll go ahead and start with in-person public comment. At this time, I haven't received any speaker slips, but just as a reminder, if you do wish to speak in person, you can fill out a speaker slip by the back door. Seeing no one move to speak, I'll go ahead and move to virtual public comment. If you wish to speak on Zoom at this time, you can raise your hand and I'll call on you. I don't see any hands raised on Zoom, and we also did not receive any general written correspondence, so I'll pass it over to you, Chair Kalas.
Thank you very much. Okay, that will conclude public comment, and we'll move on to item B, which is approval of the minutes of the Single Family Design Board for June 20th, 2023. This is the full board meeting from that day. I've reviewed these. I don't have any comments. Does anybody else from the board or staff have any comments, corrections, clarifications that they feel need to be made? Okay, so I will move to approve the minutes from June 20th of 2023. Do I have a second?
I'll second that.
If we could take a roll call, please.
Chair Kalas,
Yes.
Vice Chair Anderson,
Yes.
Board Member Garfighty,
Yes.
Board Member Lewis,
Yes.
Board Member Sherry.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll continue with consent calendar meetings from July 10th, 2023. I was present for this consent calendar. I have reviewed these minutes and did not find any need for any clarifications or corrections. I don't know if anybody else from the board has. If so, please feel free to comment. Okay, hearing no comments, I will move to approve these minutes from the 10th of July, 2023. Do I have a second?
Second.
If we could have a roll call, please.
Chair Kalas,
Yes?
Vice Chair Anderson,
Yes.
Board Member Garfighty,
Yes.
Board Member Lewis,
Yes.
Board Member Sherry.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, and moving on to next set of meeting minutes. These are from July 17th, earlier today, 2023, and Ms. Garfighty was present. So, Ms. Garfighty, I'll let you speak to these minutes if you have any comments.
I've reviewed the minutes and I don't have any comments. Does anybody else have any comments or corrections? Okay. I will move to approve the minutes from July 17th consent calendar.
I'll second. If we could have a roll call, please.
Chair Kalas,
Yes?
Vice Chair Anderson,
Yes.
Board Member Garfighty,
Yes.
Board Member Lewis,
Yes.
Board Member Sherry.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to item D, announcements, requests by applicants for continuances, withdrawals, future agenda items, and appeals. Do we have any announcements from the board?
I have one. I'm not going to be in town on July 31st for that meeting.
Thanks for letting me know.
Well, we hope that's for something fun. Is there anything from staff?
Chair Kalas, board members, couple announcements. Chair Kalas was officially reappointed to the SFDB by City Council, so that's great news.
Thank you.
And we're opening an ABR special recruitment. There's one vacancy, and City Council is voting on that tomorrow. And should that be approved, the application would open and be open until August 17th. So just encouraging you to reach out to your network if possible. And then I understand interviews at City Council and appointments would happen on August 29th. And then lastly, if Leslie or Board Member Sherry, if you could share something from your subcommittee group, that would be great.
Subcommittee report. So I'll just provide a quick update. Generally speaking, I think we've had 2 meetings thus far, and really what we're trying to do is we are in the process of going through a number of subjects and topics in order to try to streamline and clarify the triggers that cause something to come either before the full board or consent calendar, or that could be dealt with on an administrative level. So we've been looking at a number of different subjects that have been identified through the working group as problematic, both from the public as well as from our board and city staff, things that we feel like can be streamlined. So we're talking about subjects like change of materials on the exterior, where a real threshold would be that would cause a trigger where that would have to come before our board rather than just being reviewed administratively. Roofing change types or types changing. Trying to clarify some issues as it surrounds decks, because those seem to be a big topic right now. So are there certain circumstances under which decks could just be administratively reviewed as opposed to having to trigger our board's review? Haven't really gotten into FARs yet. We've been kind of beginning with the low-hanging fruit, and we're starting to work into the more controversial subjects. So we haven't arrived at any specific recommendations yet, but we've come up with some ideas, and staff is trying to put language around that, and I believe that there'll be something coming out of that that we'll see that will be more formal. I think we have another 1 or 2 sessions before we would be at that point.
Thanks, Chair Kloss. That concludes my announcements.
Thank you. And that concludes subcommittee reports too, which is item E. So I think we can move on to our first agenda item today. We have 2 agenda items in terms of projects, and then we have a board training session as our final item today. So we'd ask the applicants for item 1, 1209 Del Oro, to step up. This is here for consent review and what did I say? Oh, I'm sorry, for concept review. And we will, thank you for the correction. And we will read into the record the project description, proposal for a 487 square foot first floor addition, a 262 square foot garage addition, and a new 666 square foot second story. The 6,291 square foot site is developed with a 1,031 square foot single unit, single story residence, and an existing attached 230 square foot garage. The proposed total of 2,676 square feet on a 6,290 square foot lot is 97% of the maximum required floor to lot area ratio. The garage is non-conforming and requires staff hearing officer review and approval to encroach into the front yard setback. The SHO approval, staff hearing officer approval, is also required for an FAR modification. No final appealable action will take place at this hearing. Neighborhood preservation findings would be required for a project design approval. So it sounds like the applicant is here for hopefully positive comments to take the staff hearing officer. And I did have one question for staff before we start. I noticed a discrepancy between the plans that were available for our review relative to the description that's in our agenda as it relates to square footages and FAR percentages. So if staff could clarify which one of those is accurate. If either, that would be very helpful for our board.
Sure. Thank you, Chair Colas and members of the SFDB. To answer that question, I calculated the 2,676 square feet based on what is given on the cover sheet for first floor, second floor, and garage square footages, and then that came out to 97% FAR. That is a correction item with the applicant at this time, so if they would like to further comment on that, they can. The application is incomplete. The applicant is working on addressing our corrections. So we wanted to get this project in front of you now so they could also work on any comments you may have for them. And as it is a concept review, we're looking for you to consider broad concepts such as the site planning, general architectural style, and the relationship to the site and neighborhood. Yeah, I think that's it for my opening comments. I'm here for any questions, of course. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Chair Colas.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so just for the board, I'll remind everybody that this is a required floor to lot area ratio because of lot size. And ask you to present yourself and your project, please.
Okay, thank you. My name is Kevin Moore, architect for the owner. And I have Jamie Palencia here from our studio as well. So we are here for early concept, just to check in on the mass bulk scale, general neighborhood compatibility. So we prepared this supplemental image of the neighborhood. This in red is the project site here at 1209 Del Oro. It's just above Shoreline Drive here, between La Marina and what is this? This other street here. Is this
Probably one of the Santos or something.
Ondas? I think that's Los Ondas. Yes. So it's a short little street. But what is interesting about this particular area is that all of these houses that are outlined in orange are already two-story houses. Actually, this one on the corner here, I believe, or one of these two is also, I think, just about to be developed as well into a two-story house. So you can see this street has been already pretty heavily redeveloped, and our client. A little backstory on our client. This is his aunt's house, and he grew up coming to visit Santa Barbara and visiting this house. And he's now wanting to do a modest remodel in addition to allow them to move to Santa Barbara and utilize this property. His goal is to try to maintain at least some of the street-facing charm and interest of the existing house, which we can see. Where's our image? I guess we'll have to go to this here. Zoom in. So this is essentially an original Marine Terrace version DA or whatever it is. It's small. So a small one-car garage house, and it has some of that charm, this big divided light window in the front, kind of the funky roof line, and that's what he likes about it. So we're trying to do our best to maintain the street facade, and add on where we can to try and fulfill his wish list. So to give you a little sense of the neighborhood from the ground, this is the house to the left or east of the project. So you get into, they've done a second-story addition and added on to the house such that they needed to, change the format of the garage into a two-story garage. And then to the east of that, you see a pretty large, bulky house with a two-car garage on the street. To the west is Another fairly original house here. They've added on like a second-story deck in the back across the street as well. So the existing house floor plan. Street is down sheet here, single car garage with the little driveway. You would come into the little covered porch, into the living room, and have a small kitchen, and then it's 3 bedrooms, 1 bath. Unfortunately, the backyard is big, but it's all back here. So unfortunately, kind of not how we would lay that house out today. We'd want to have a more direct connection with that big backyard and where the sun is facing, or where the sun is hitting that yard. So our client's goals, I'll just read them off here, were to keep the original character of the street facade, connect the living spaces of the house to the backyard, add a master suite, enlarge the living room and kitchen spaces, and try and catch a small ocean view. So what we've done to try and meet these goals is to rework the house a little bit. So we want to keep the charm of the front facade. To do that, we want to try to maintain this single car garage frontage. Because as you see elsewhere, if you do a double wide garage, it dominates the facade, and that's really not what we want to have happen for this house. In order to do that, we have to keep this remodel and addition below the threshold for a substantial improvement, is that what it's called? Substantial redevelopment. So we're limited in what we can do, how much we can change. So we're below that threshold. We qualify for the ability to leave the garage in this format. We've been working with transportation to satisfy their concerns, and hopefully we've done that. What that allows us to do, because of the wide side yard here on the east, that allows us to take that entry point from the middle of the house and have you come in along the side and create the entry here, about midway along the side. That lets us open up into a great room that directly connects into the backyard. Maintains 2 small bedrooms downstairs, the bathroom, laundry room, kitchen, and then upstairs we have the master suite. You come up this stair and have bathroom, closet, master bedroom, small deck off the back. Now, you can see that what we've done is gathered all this development on the second floor into the center of the house, center of the lot. And that does, obviously that's intentional to try and be a good neighbor and not expand up to the side yard setbacks. It also works well with the configuration of, the houses to the south. So here's our property. You can see that roughly in the center we have that shared property line. Hopefully we maintain some level of view corridor out through the setbacks. Okay. And the roof plan and our proposed elevations. So we'll start with the street, which is north in this case. So you can see we've maintained the big picture window with the divided lights. We have the single car garage, at least from street view, it appears to be a single car garage. And then remodel these 2 windows. This is the existing roof shape here. And then well back of that, you see our second floor addition and little stair tower to get us up there. One of the more interesting views is this. This is the west elevation, so our street and sidewalk is out here. Property line is here. You can see how far back the second floor addition is from the street to really minimize the impact on that street. And then as well back here, our property line is here. We still have a pretty good chunk of backyard set back here for that second floor addition. On the opposite side of the house, the east elevation, this is the entry here. So you would come down this side of the house and into this door here, a little covered entry here. This stair tower here, we feel helps to create or is an element that helps to bridge the existing with the new. And we've got some other images of that, so here's the view from the street. We have a low wall out front to guide the visitor to the front door, down the path, and in. We'll have landscape features out here eventually once we get to that point to help buffer some of that view and provide some privacy from the street. And here's a little bit more of that entry sequence. It's important to note that, okay. It's important to note that, all of these second floor windows, these are up high, so you won't be looking down into other people's yards. Obviously along the back, we have some folding windows or sliding doors. We're not sure yet what the configuration will be there. But the intent is to provide privacy in between neighbors. So that, anything to add, Jamie?
That was good.
Okay. I will conclude there.
Great, thank you. So before we get into questions or comments, we will open up the floor to public comment. Mariah, if you could help us with that, please.
All right, thank you, Chair Collas. I'll go ahead and start with in-person public comment. At this time, I haven't received any speaker slips. If you do wish to speak in person, you can fill out a speaker slip by the back door. Seeing no one move to speak, I'll go ahead and move to virtual public comment. If you wish to make a comment online, you can raise your hand at this time and I'll call on you. I don't see any hands raised, and we also did not receive any written correspondence for this item, so I'll turn it back over to you, Chair Collas.
Okay, great. So I'll open it up to questions. Would anybody like to start with questions for Mr. Moore?
I can start.
Okay, Ms. Lewis, please.
So first off, can you address the discrepancy in the FAR between your drawings and what's listed?
Go ahead.
Yeah, it was my fault. I didn't add the garage.
Oh, got it. Okay.
So
Can
So
you please,
what they've listed is correct.
can you please turn your microphone on and introduce yourself for the record, please?
yeah, my name is Jamie Plencia.
Oh.
What was it?
It looks on, but it's not.
Press down.
Right in the middle? There you go.
My name is Jamie Plencia. I'm with Kevin Moore Architects. And the 97% is correct because I did not add the garage square footage. So,
Okay. Second question, I see that the roof is listed as a standing seam metal, so is the intent also for the existing roof to be replaced with that?
Yes.
Okay. Next, the low wall I see is 42 inches, and I'm looking at some of the views and going down that street. Also, most of the other low walls in the front tend to be much shorter or just a raised planter bed. Can you describe the intent for a taller wall there?
Well, 42 inches was what we landed on. We're certainly happy to reduce that if need be. The idea was just to help really guide people to that new entry sequence. So,
That's a great segue into, can you describe more the intent of bringing the entry to this side and not from the street view?
well, it's For a couple of reasons, it's advantageous. Obviously, to our plan, you can see the existing entrance is here. So with the owner's goal of being to connect the rear of the house and convert that to the kitchen, living room, dining use, if we were to maintain this as the front door, it's really disruptive to the existing floor plan to get through all of this program to then get to the great room. So what that would have done is probably created a larger house, more bulky house, because we'd have like a hallway situation cutting through the house to get to that. So what we've done is utilize what's there with this large side yard to come essentially past all of this program, maintain that character to get you into the great room, public areas of the house, which then connects nicely to the backyard.
I'm wondering, so I'm trying to balance between comments and questions, but one of our guidelines is to have the entry visible. And I see that you have a 6-foot setback, and so there's still room there. Did you consider any other kind of footprint adjustments that would have allowed you to have the entry off the front there, but maybe on the side, or adjusting some of that front, or other ways, either some kind of way to extend that entry off so it is visible and inviting?
Our hope is to create, this is the first stab at, it's a low wall. Perhaps it's set back more and there's more of an expression of an entry gate there that would signal that this is the entry. And I think we could be successful with that.
That's all the questions for now.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? Ms. Graffitti?
Yes. Could you cover the purpose or the intention with the tower element, not the stair tower element, but the other element towards the backyard? Yes.
That piece and plan. So this is would be a interior fireplace, so kind of a ribbon fireplace. So it has some width to it. So that's one of the reasons for it being there. And secondly, just as in composition, it helps, at least in our minds, it helps us in this area to find a way to end these roof forms, so it captures the ends of these roofs. And it also provides a little bit of relief from all of this back here in the backyard. And then it's also at the rear of the house and not particularly visible from the street. And the client has some interior ambitions as well of things he's trying to replicate in another house. So that's also guiding the shape of that element.
Okay, thanks. I think my other questions have been answered, so thank you.
Ms. Sherry, I saw you nodding your head.
Yeah.
Questions?
What's the modification for FAR again? Since it's 97%?
So another one of the correction items is to verify the height. It doesn't appear to be measured correctly. So if the height is over 25 feet and the FAR is over 85%, then that requires a modification when both of those elements are present. So that's another thing we're working out.
Yeah. The intent is that we'd be below 25 feet, which would take
you
us
wouldn't
out of
need
the
the modification.
Correct.
Okay. And then where's your solar ordinance, 12 feet, 30 degree? I just want to, I'm sure your fireplace element doesn't encroach, but because it seems like it's far enough back, oh, there it is.
Yeah. So we're well under that with this design. That's one of the reasons that this roof form is is
I
doing
was
this.
wondering why that was
Yeah.
lower.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you still meet your 6'8" barely, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. No more questions, thank you.
Ms. Anderson?
Yeah, I'm back on the side entry. What is the distance between the existing house is in between? I mean, it's a large space out in the field, I know that. But yeah, most of the entrances along the street are all on the front of the houses. So just trying to, justify that side entry, which potentially creates noise. It's different than the other neighborhood houses. So, so what is the distance you have in between the houses there? And did you potentially discuss that with that adjacent neighbor?
So the door is, you can see 14'7" off the property line, and then we've got 12 feet there, 14'6" here. So, there's a pretty healthy setback here. This house kind of peels away from the property line there as well. This is sort of their side yard. Most of their activity is happening back here. I think, or I feel, that this entry sequence, although removed from the street, I think can be done successfully. We could potentially extend this landing out more if the board is feeling that it's not visible enough or doesn't have enough presence. I think we could make this area, embellish it a little bit to create that sense of a porch almost at that location. So that as you're coming along here, this wall or whatever barrier we choose here will guide you to this location, and you'll see that as the front door.
So did you discuss the entry with that adjacent neighbor?
Not at this time.
Okay, and yeah, the second question was most of the other houses on the street have front porches, so, and your existing house does have the front porch. So, any other thoughts about the front porch?
Well, I would say that the trade-off to keep the existing configuration would result in a much less desirable outcome for the owner and for the street. You would end up with something more like this, where our garage would have to expand. We would have to do a much larger remodel in addition to accommodate keeping that front porch element where it is. Does that make sense?
Sure, thank you. You showed and added some FAR studies for us, which, when you're over the 85%, we always want to see the justification provided for, we've been saying 10 closest houses, not 20. But you did not provide, or do you know, the densities and the FARs of all the 2 stories in your neighborhood there? Did you do that work for us? Because that helps us,
We haven't-
justify your 97%.
Sure. We don't have the numbers, but visually, I think you can see that our proposal is for 666 square feet on the second level and just under 200 square feet on the ground floor. It's a pretty modest addition to this house, and I think you can see, just based on this aerial photo, what has been done elsewhere in this neighborhood. So I think as far as compatibility with mass, bulk, and scale, we're definitely below the what is existing just next door and then just down the street, and even what was recently built over here on the corner. So,
So no, you haven't provided, I mean, it just is a checkbox for us. Great, because I believe most of those houses are beyond even the 97% in your adjacent street. But having that number for us, along with some street silhouettes, you know, of the adjacent neighbor, okay, you know, they're large, 2 stories, makes it a heck of a lot easier for us to justify the 97% FAR. And you're not proposing an ADU of any sort that I heard, correct?
nope.
Okay.
Vice Chair Colas, if I could interject at this point, I just wanted to clarify, we still are working out FAR with the applicant. It was a correction item. I think they thought it was under 85% when they submitted. And they have not asked to waive those requirements. However, this would be the meeting where an applicant would do so. So we can certainly come back with that information for you.
Just a couple other things. The stair tower windows, have you considered any other privacy, semi-transparent glazing? I mean, there's a perceived kind of privacy thing with that element on the side yard.
So this, the adjacent house that would be somewhat impacted right here. So this area, oh, come on. This is the garage right here. Our stair tower element is approximately here in plan. This is ground floor here. This is their second level up here. So the stair tower, you know, it's meant to be above your eye line. Maybe you catch a little bit of view out at that uppermost step, but as soon as you start going down the stair, you're going to be below that sill, and you're not going to be looking down or out, really. It's more for gathering light and creating an interesting element.
Thank you. Yes, understood that. It just, the adjacent neighbor has this open, clear glazing, so you're kind of like, oh, you know, privacy, perceived privacy. That's what I was questioning there, but thank you.
And we haven't gotten into a landscape design yet. And I
Right.
think there's opportunity in that side yard to provide some significant
privacy.
buffer.
Okay. The front door garage, are you, so what, I was unclear on your single-car garage. It's going to be a single tandem, right? But that is going to be a garage door.
Correct.
Okay. All right. And the existing plate heights in the front, the 8-foot you're keeping, and your roof lines are different slopes. I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
Okay, I have a couple questions. Many of them were asked by the other board members. So just to be clear, and not to beat a dead horse, but to maybe just slightly hurt it a little more. In terms of pattern of development, if you were to just kind of summarize, at least, you know, let's call it, the 10 neighbors, would you say that all of them, 90% of them, do they all have an entry that is oriented off of the front facade that faces the street? Do any of them have, I'm getting into patterns of development here is what I'm trying to get at. So my question is there any precedent for what you are proposing in terms of the entry sequence to the home in the neighborhood that you know of?
Well, I mean, there's certainly entrances that are set well back from the street, you know, for instance, this,
Are there any on the side of the homes? It's just a simple question.
not that I'm aware of.
Okay. And,
Well, I'm sorry, I'll take that back. This particular house, I've actually been in this. The entrance is actually tucked around back in here.
so kind of off the driveway.
You walk down the driveway, you kind of hang a left into it, into there. It's back kind of there.
Okay, so that front wall that extends kind of privatizes that entry sequence.
Yes.
Okay. Can we see, I think it was, I believe it would be the west elevation. Okay, so is there a deck off of the master suite on the front of the home as well as the rear? Or
Yeah,
what is that element there?
Yeah, a little deck, very small. I can show you in plan. So it's here. So you come up the stairs, there's this little vestibule, either go into the master suite, or there's a door here to come out onto this.
And what is the idea behind that? Is it,
Well,
I mean, I can understand the other one because you're trying to capture the ocean views, which was one of your major goals out of the master suite.
Well, we have this transition piece here of roof. You know, we have the existing roof out here. And we have to, create a transition between this and the new. So this could just be one large cricket, or we could, do something interesting there and add an element that's, pretty small. It's not meant for large gatherings or
Yeah, it
anything
looks like it's
that.
tucked behind the ridge.
Yeah, it's tucked behind the ridge, and it's really, maybe, it's more of a gesture. It's certainly not a gathering place or a place to make noise or have a barbecue.
Okay.
It's just a transition.
Okay. I'm looking at my list of questions here just to see what was covered versus what wasn't. I know you said you'd get into landscaping down the line, and I understand that, but can you just describe or maybe show us in the aerial photos, if at all possible, what the existing property line conditions are on the east side between this parcel and the neighbor, since we are talking about an entry sequence there?
Let's see if I can find it. So here's the existing house over here. You can see there's this 6-foot redwood fence here, and currently, you can't really, it's not the best view of it, but it's a little bit better. There's not a lot existing in between the two of them. There's a fence currently.
Okay. So that 6-foot fence that privatizes the rear yard for the neighbor returns along the property line?
Correct.
Okay. And then could you just walk us through, since there's a question about heights, could you walk us through what is, I'll put it this way, what is currently memorialized in the drawings that are before us for review today, in terms of plate heights and overall heights?
Yes. So what we have, so currently the max ridge height as we have on our drawings is 24'7" and a quarter. That we're measuring from the existing slab, so that's the discrepancy. We need to measure from the existing grade, which will, bump it up 8 inches or so. So what we'll be doing is modifying this ridge height to get back below 25 feet.
Okay, and do you anticipate doing that by a change in plate heights or a change in roof pitch?
Plate height.
Okay, so what are your current plate heights on both the first and the second floor?
So I'll go to the sections here. So we are proposing on the first floor, 9'4", and then a 9-foot on the second.
Okay.
So we'll bring that down. This is vaulted up here, so we can capture that volume, and that's fine.
Okay. Okay, so the only other question that I'll ask is, how would you describe the, and I know Ms. Sherry loves this question because I've asked her before. How would you describe the architectural style that you're proposing?
Well, I guess the current term is transitional, I believe. That's what people would call it, where it's sort of in between styles. It's not
tweener.
this, it's not that. It's, yeah, transitional. I believe that's the current term.
Okay, and you're generally talking about plaster, stuccoed exterior, and then some elements that would vary in texture or finishes. The tower element, the chimney element, roofing element would vary, would be
Yeah,
different.
definitely on the stair element, we want that to have a different material, whether that's a vertical, siding element. The fireplace element, we're less worried about that. Currently, it's rendered in like a sandstone, but that may end up being just a different plaster color
Okay,
in the end.
okay. I think those were my only questions. So would anybody like to start with comments? Does anybody have comments?
I'll start. I mean, I know that we've touched on it, but I think it's important to study a design option that shows the entry from the street view. It's something within our design guidelines, and I think it's important for the neighborhood. I don't think that it will require a complete redesign or changing the garages, but even if there's some entity that comes out, there is a precedent in the neighborhood to have a set back entrance. So it doesn't need to be at the very front of the building, but I do think being able to see it. I'll also point out that the neighbor immediately adjacent to where the entrance is has an outdoor shower, just a few feet off the side view. So even just from enjoyability of the property, I think it would be nice. And I would also like to see in the next development, we'll see the landscape, but more development of that entry yard and how it maybe relates to the other neighbors. I'm not sure. So with the mandatory FAR, how much do we have a say in the scale of it?
If it's a required FAR, our guideline is typically 85%, but there's nothing that restricts them, and staff, please correct me if I'm wrong, from meeting a 100% FAR. But as a board, we would need to be able to, I think, justify that since it exceeds guideline.
Okay. I'll add the comment then. I do think that it will be good to have the nearest 10 to 20 houses there on your street to help justify the increase. And I'm looking at my notes. I feel like there was one more. I'll start with that and I may come back.
Okay, thank you. Next, would anybody else like to make comments?
I'll make a comment.
Okay, Ms. Sherry.
I think it's a really nice project, and I agree with the relocation of the front door. And if there's anything that you could do, I know you can do it with landscaping, but if there's something that would, a wayfinding way, like you mentioned, a covered porch or something, that might be an interesting opportunity. But I couldn't agree with you more about why you put the front door there. And I don't think that just because there aren't any houses on that side of the street that have front doors on the side, that it means that you couldn't do it on this house. I think that I'm comfortable with the FAR based on the other houses that I've seen in the area. Sometimes it's really hard to get accurate FARs of the adjacent homes. So, and if the majority of the board feels that it's necessary, then I guess you got to do it. I am comfortable with it because of the style of the high-quality design and the proportions and the mass book and scale. I'm comfortable with the 97%.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Grafiti, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I would just say, excuse me, adding on to what the other board members have said, I would agree with the comments around the front entry, again, pointing to guidelines, but I'll also say as personally, as somebody that's had a weird front door entry, it is very obnoxious when you're the homeowner, and so just for their own personal use of it, I think it definitely working out different solutions and from my opinion, I don't need to see a precedent of a front entry located where it's at all. I think it can be compatible without there being an example of something else on that street. But more so, again, working on the solutions, the landscaping, wall, is it square like that? Could you bend? I think there's probably a lot of different options you can pull from to see success that I'd be able to support that. In terms of the FAR, just based on the way that the second story is proportioned and centered towards the center of the home, and just driving that street and being familiar with that neighborhood, I personally wouldn't need to see a 10 or 20 closest homes to justify that FAR. I think there's a little bit of sticker shock to 97%, but just the way that you've oriented the home, I think that size actually works well, and I definitely think it will be an improvement to what's there today and to the neighborhood, so appreciate this.
So just a point of clarification, Ms. Grafiti, before we moved on.
Yes.
I heard two different things related to the front entry. At first, I heard you say it sounded like you wanted to see the entry facing the street. And then I heard you make further comments about how landscaping can be successful to guide somebody to an entrance. So I'm trying to figure
Yeah.
out what your position
Sorry.
is on the location.
My
of the
intention with that
entrance.
comment was just not saying that I'm recommending you move it, but further working out how a side entry or something similar in placement or design would be able to be successful. And as an aside, just mentioning, again, pointing to our guidelines and what we recommend, yes, there's recommendations for it to be in the front and more prominent. And as a side, again, as somebody that has lived in a home where it is on the side, it can be challenging. But I would still, given all of that, I would still be in support of where you're proposing, the location of where you'd propose it. I just would like to see, maybe a more prominent patio or landscaping or other, I'm not an architect, but other elements detailed more or worked out to make that more prominent and obvious from facing the street. So sorry for the confusion there.
Okay, so I'm going to try to summarize. You might lean more heavily towards the entrance being street-oriented, but you think that the side entry could be successful with proper and further development.
Correct.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, Ms. Anderson, any comments?
The FAR, I would like the 30-minute exercise of documenting the 10 closest homes with the numbers, even if they're estimates. That gives us the backup as a board to justify the 97%. The second floor, the scale, the massing is fine. Love the way you centered it off of the setbacks. With good articulation there, and trying to keep the first floor, and most of the existing neighborhood is that way. So we've got a good concept going. The side entry, though, I feel at this point is not compatible with the neighborhood. You could come back with, yes, we talked to the neighbors, yes, we have landscaping, and we incorporated some kind of front porch potentially, that I'm fine with on the next round. But at this point, I'm feeling concern for the neighbor with the noise primarily into their side yard. Concept, I'm not going to go on to window openings, but yeah, window opening articulation. We'll see when you come back.
I just forgot my circled positive comments, and so I want to include those. But I do think that the bulk of it and the scale from the street view is good, and seconding the comments of the location of the second floor. And also wanted to indicate that I don't see a problem with the garage sticking out, since that was an existing condition. Though normally I think that it is quite close, but I do want to speak in support of that.
Okay. Okay, I agree with Ms. Anderson and Ms. Lewis that I would like to see some supplemental information in regards to the FARs, and I'm going to ask for some staff direction on this. I think it would be appropriate to see FARs for all of the homes on this street, Del Oro. There are a lot of two-story houses, but when we do a count, starts getting pretty close to a 50-50 split. Especially when you're looking at the two houses that are south of this one of which this project is somewhat dependent upon, probably for capturing those second-story views. And where I was going to go with this in terms of staff direction is, so a lot of these are 2 stories. I don't know how many of them may have an integrated ADU as part of those. So I don't think it's fair to compare our 97% to all of the development on a property if there's an integrated ADU in that. Reason being that this could be developed with an ADU later, and so really in order to compare apples to apples, we need to be comparing, I'll call it the net square footage of the primary residences. So I don't know how we can parse that out, but the goal would be to be comparing the principal residence FARs for each lot, in my mind. So that would be one of my comments. I feel your pain, Mr. Moore, in terms of trying to reorient the entrance. I was working on a property also on the Mesa, and we had the same dilemma. She wanted to put a pool in the backyard. She wanted the big great room with the accordion doors off the back. And how do we achieve that when your front door's the front, and then all of a sudden you have this big sort of gallery or corridor that runs down the center of it? So I understand why you've placed the entry on the side, and I'm loath to say that I'm in support or not of that at this point without additional information related to landscaping. I really want to see more information on the uses of the adjacent property in terms of their floor plan. If in fact you're just up against their garage and let's say their laundry room, it's probably not as much of an issue in my mind as if the master bedroom is over there, where, they're going to be trying to sleep at night and you're going to have people coming and going. So some additional information in that regard so that we understand relationships between uses and landscaping and how we might deal with acoustical issues there would be helpful. If you decide to pursue that entry location, and I would agree with Ms. Gerfeidi and the others who have talked about, development of that entry sequence in order for it to be successful. I understand Ms. Anderson's concern. I think it's less about acoustic privacy as it is about maybe light pollution that could come out of that tower and affect the neighboring property. So I think developing that and figuring that out in a meaningful way is important. Our guidelines, and I could go to the page, but our guidelines really say that one is supposed to pick a distinct architectural style, and that's supposed to translate across a project. So I appreciate your deft response of this being a transitional style home. But at the outset, you were saying something to the nature of your client really likes sort of the simple funkiness of this house. And so I'm looking at this.
Front of the house.
Okay, of the front of the house, okay. So, and you've been pretty successful maintaining that. Looking at that front elevation, the addition looks very tall to me. Like I want it to be hunkered down a little bit more, but I also understand from a pedestrian standpoint, and when you're looking at the side elevations, that it's not necessarily going to read that way. I feel like the chimney element is a little bit awkward, for lack of a better way of putting it. But that's at the rear, and that I know that's being driven by client program. So it's less of an issue for me than the front. One of the board members, I can't remember who this was, it might have been Ms. Anderson, was alluding to the idea of kind of maybe an homage to the front porch. I don't know, is there a way to extend the eaves on the front and sort of create the idea of the old front porch and, I don't know, pay homage to it in that way? These are just questions I ask myself. I don't have any issues with the standing seam. I think it would probably make a lot of sense, especially in this environment. So I think development of finishes is going to be important. Could you show us on the floor plan which walls, I know this is getting into staff review, but I'm really trying to understand how this is going to be a substantial, or how this is not going to be a substantial redevelopment. I'd like to understand that, because that's, a lot of what we're talking about is being driven by that determination. And
Not necessarily. It is a completeness item for them to show that and get some signatures from the engineer and those types of folks. If it is substantial redevelopment, they would need an additional modification to encroach into they're already encroaching into the front setback. Yeah, it doesn't really make a difference, honestly, as in terms of modifications. It's just knowing what's going to happen.
so if this were deemed a substantial redevelopment, is there still opportunity to have the tandem car configuration for a two-car garage? I'm seeing staff
Yeah, I
nodding in
think
affirmation. I'm seeing the applicant.
transportation may or may not be supportive. I don't know.
Can I answer that?
Yes, please.
So in our investigations with transportation, they would then, first of all, it's not a substantial redevelopment. We're well under that threshold.
Okay.
We've shown that on a diagram, we resubmitted it, and we hope that will be deemed complete this next round.
Okay.
If it were a substantial redevelopment, we would then be required to widen the driveway and create, essentially be forced into that two-car width garage.
Configuration.
We would also have to push the garage back, which would essentially, we would have to start over with the
Right.
house at
Okay.
that point.
Understandable.
Brand-new house.
Okay. The reason that I asked that question is there is opportunity to push the house on the easterly side, I believe, based on setbacks. Were we seeing that in the site plan? Yeah,
Talking about over here?
yeah. Okay, I'm just thinking about the dilemma that you're having in terms of an entry sequence and what the opportunities are there. So, it would be interesting to see if there is a solution that could be had with a front entry that maintains the pattern of development. Maybe the living use is gang up on one side and you have access to the backyard at the end of that great room as opposed to it being across the back. It's a site planning issue, and I'm just looking at what your opportunities are there in terms of the setback on the easterly side. Those are my comments. Based on what I'm hearing, I don't think we're going to be able to provide you with comments today for your staff hearing officer. I think we're going to be in a position where we're going to have to return this to the full board. Does anybody disagree with that?
I do, because I'm the one that's okay with the FAR. But, so I have a question for the rest of you. And like I said, if everybody wants it, you guys are going to have to do it. My question to myself, when I hear these requests for the 20 closest homes, is I always think worst case scenario, like what if there are no other homes that are 97%? Does that mean we're going to deny this project? That's the question that we need to ask ourselves. So if in other words, why are we asking for the information, and do we think that we're going to deny this design, or that it's not designed sensitively enough to support a 97% coverage, because it is under 100%. So that's just a question for all of us to ask ourselves.
So it's a good question, and it's one of the reasons that I'm trying to drill down on what the percentage of what the FAR percentages is sans ADU. Because then what happens when this gets developed with an ADU? Now we're at 120, we're at 130. We're clearly over required guideline at that point. And I
Well, but at
understand we
that
have
point,
no jurisdiction over the ADU. I know that's not our purview. But we do have a guideline of 85% on a required lot like this. And so if we can hold the line and make sure that we're not getting overdeveloped, that is the purview of this board at this juncture, is to avoid McMansionization. So
Yeah.
that's why I'm saying that.
I understand, but I am also looking at this particular lot and the potential to do an ADU on this lot with the open yard is already, like, it's kind of at, the footprint development potential on this lot is pretty much at its maximum, which is why I'm more comfortable with the number.
And I also think we need to be careful to just review the project that's before us today. There's no ADU proposed at this time, so I understand where you're thinking ahead, but, and FAR is just one of the tools also that you have as a board to determine neighborhood compatibility. It's not the only tool, and sometimes it's not the best tool, so just keep those things in mind.
Okay, well, what I'm hearing is that 3 of us want it and 2 of us don't care. So I think the direction would be that the majority rules and that we'd be asking for that. Okay. So would anybody, pardon me? Would anybody care to make a motion? I'm assuming that we're going to return this to full board with specific direction to the client. Okay, so I'm going to take a stab at it here. So this will be continued indefinitely back to the full board unless you wanted this continued in 2 weeks.
No, yeah, that's really hard to do, and I don't think we have room for quite a while. So let's do indefinite, and then we'll get you on as soon as possible.
Okay, so this will be continued back to our full board with the following comments. The board would like to request an FAR study for all houses that face Del Oro in order to justify the requested 97% FAR. The board is split in its opinion in regards to the side entry orientation, and we would ask the applicant to study the opportunity to introduce an entry on the elevation that faces the street. I believe that'd be the northerly elevation, and/or to further develop the existing proposed entry sequence into the home via the easterly elevation. If the applicant chooses to pursue the latter, we would ask that they provide us with further information in regards to landscaping or mitigation measures that would address any acoustical concerns with the easterly property that flanks this. And that would include information on the uses that face the westerly property line for that easterly neighbor. The board generally agrees that the massing of the second story as proposed is both acceptable and meets the guidelines of the SFDRB in that it steps back from really all four facades. And I believe we are all in support of the garage sitting forward of the street-facing wall of the residence itself because it continues an underlying pattern of development for the neighborhood. We would ask that the applicant return with corrected heights that are denoted in a manner congruent with staff direction. That would be my motion, and it's open for comments or
Chair
clarification.
Colossus, can I clarify your comment on the FAR study for homes, Del Oro, homes facing Del Oro? Do you mean for this block, or?
It's all homes on Del Oro, so I believe that's almost 20
Is that
homes.
just
It's
that's the
approximately
only?
20 homes. That's what we would be deeming that as the neighborhood.
Okay.
And to further clarify, did you want only the primary residence square footage included in the FAR? And then a separate line item, whether it's an attached garage or a detached garage?
I think the more myopic this study can be, the more broken down it can be, the better, but I'll leave that up to the applicant. Okay, so that's the motion on the table. Do I have a second or any comments?
Second.
Okay, if we could take roll call, please.
Chair Colossus,
Yes.
Vice Chair Anderson,
Yes.
Board Member Graffitti,
Yes.
Board Member Lewis,
Yes.
Board Member Sherry.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we will move on to item 2, 3855 Callecita, the Little Street. This is here before us today for project design approval, It is a proposal to construct a new 2,361 square foot two-story residence with a 427 square foot garage on a 10,000 square foot vacant lot with an existing creek and drainage area. The project received front setback and interior setback modification approvals from the staff hearing officer on June 14th of '23. The proposed total of 2,788 square feet of development on a 10,000 square foot lot is 75% of the required floor to lot area ratio. Project design approval is requested. Neighborhood preservation findings are required. And the project requires compliance with Staff Hearing Officer Resolution Number 023-23. The project was last reviewed on April 24th of '23 by our board. If the applicants would please introduce themselves, bring up the meetings from our last minute, and just run us through everything. Let us know if anything has changed or if there was anything that needed to be addressed, how it's been addressed, and specifically provide us with, just articulate how this is complying with the resolution from the staff hearing officer.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm John Mullen, and next to me is Martha DeGasis. She is our landscape architect, and next to her is Jim Firth, who we're representing. When we last appeared before you, we had responded to your request to provide an FAR analysis of 20 contiguous properties to show compatibility with surrounding neighborhood. Also, a modification to the westerly elevation to provide relief by adding a gable element, softening the color palette to blend into the landscaping, and agreeing to the hedge on the westerly side to be maintained in perpetuity. On June 14th, we appeared before the modification hearing officer and received final approval for our reduced front and side yard setback, and we're here today to request project design approval. And if your board grants us this approval, we'd like to return on August 14th for our final approval with working drawings. Consent would be great. That'd be wonderful. And to answer your question, there haven't been any changes.
Okay. Do we have the staff hearing officer resolution, just so we can,
Yes, Chair
See if
Colas.
there was anything.
I can pull that up. Just one moment.
thank you.
So the case planner for this project's out today, but as stated in the project description, it received approval on June 14th. Here's the staff hearing officer resolution on the screen. We'll zoom in a bit.
For some reason, that's not coming up on our screens.
A front setback modification was granted for an encroachment into the front, as well as an interior setback modification. And I understand the staff hearing officer also included the SFDB's condition to retain the westerly screening. I can zoom in more so it's visible up there for you all.
Can you scroll, I guess, pull the page down, scroll up? Will you see item C, please?
Sure. This just has to do with the CEQA
It's just exempt,
determination.
okay. Okay. Okay, great. If you could just run us through the drawings real quickly so we could just make sure they're looking like they did, that would be great.
Let's actually go to the plan first. Site plan? Yeah, site plan. I'll just remind. So this proposed residence is on, as you know, Cayacita, and this is a vacant lot. It's 10,000 square feet. We've worked really over the last year with planning as well as Creeks Division on the setback, and I think we've talked about this before, that this residence is really pretty boxed in from the standpoint of where we can place it. And at this point, you can see the residence, the footprint, You can also see to the left side is Cayacita with the entrance driveway, and along the east you'll see the water course. And just so, we've never called this a creek because it doesn't really even, the 100-year flood doesn't really even affect this water course. But we've established the setback, and planning on May 17th sent us their completeness letter. So planning at this point has said the project is complete. So that's our site plan. Next page. And so this is our first floor plan. And we did, we'll show you the modifications that we made, but basically, we have not really made any major modifications to the first floor, none since last time, of course. And then the next page. This shows you the second floor plan, where you'll see that on the westerly side, where there's that niche there, where we've added a gable, and we'll show that to you on page 6. And so, again, on the massing on that west side, we came back and created that gable as well as a hedge, and you had asked that hedge remain in perpetuity, and we've agreed to that. So that's the elevations of the project, and then let's go to the next. Go back a page. And so also we softened on the color scheme, and that was a part of your request. And let's go to the next page. And again, this is just showing you, and of course that's the retention basin. So this is Tier 3, and so we have submitted all of the Tier 3, reports, and planning has accepted those as well. So that's your grading and drainage plan. It should be balancing on site. That's just showing you the sections through that water course. Go to the next page. And now we're going to move into some of the planting. So, Martha, why don't you just go through the planting?
Yeah, so the entire palette is native and native hybrid plants. The plant material within the creek setback is locally sourced South Coast genetic stock, so, very pure approach to the waterway there. Existing oak trees are shown in the light green. There's a cluster of olive trees that's a bit to the north in this area that will be removed. All non-native plants will be removed, and this entire waterway within the setback will be restored and vegetated. The detention basin sort of slopes underneath that rear deck there, and that's planted in native grasses. The front driveway will be concrete, the front walkway a flagstone, front porch here a flagstone. We have a small canopy tree of a native redbud, ceanothus, coffeeberry, that kind of thing. We've got 3 24-inch box coast live oaks proposed on these, sort of this triangular arrangement, as mitigation for one, excuse me, I misspoke. I think we have 5 new coast live oaks for mitigation for removal of 1. Substantial screening on this east property line with toyons and California wax myrtle and so on. And then our hedge on the side there, in addition to a solid fence on this west side, and that'll be wax myrtle as well.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, that's it. That's the end of our presentation.
Okay. So we'll conclude the applicant's presentation. They have almost 10 minutes left if they need it, and we'll open it to the board for any questions. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, public comment. Thank you, Mr. Fidey. We'll open this item for public comment. Mariah?
Thank you, Chair Colossus. I'll go ahead and start with in-person public comment. At this time, I haven't received any speaker slips. And seeing no one move to speak, I'll go ahead and move to virtual public comment. If you wish to speak on Zoom at this time, you can raise your hand and I'll call on you. I don't see any hands raised on Zoom, and we also did not receive any written correspondence for this item, so I'll turn it back over to you, Chair Kloss.
Thank you. Okay, so with that, does anybody have any questions for the applicants?
Have you gotten into exterior lighting? Or that might come in the next round? Or if, I mean,
Yeah, we're coming, so we're finishing up the working drawings right now, so we'll be back with you, hopefully on August 14th.
Okay.
So we'll go over all that with you at that time.
great, thank you.
Okay, does anybody have any comments? Okay, I am going to make a motion that this project be continued back to consent calendar on August 14th of 2023 for a final approval, and I'd like to make the necessary findings to give this project design approval today. So, we can make neighborhood preservation findings. The proposed development is consistent with the city and its neighborhood in size, bulk, and scale. Exterior quality architectural materials are being used. The colors have been muted as requested to blend more with the natural appearance of the existing property, which is unimproved. The trees that are being removed are being mitigated with 5 new Quercus agrifolia. Health, safety, and welfare of the public are being preserved in that there are significant measures being taken to address drainage on the property. And we don't anticipate any issues with neighbors because it is a vacant parcel that is surrounded on 2 sides with vacant land, and it sits lower than and significantly distant from the easterly neighbor, and there are no public views that are affected by the proposed development. That is my motion.
I'll second.
If we could have a roll call, please.
Chair Kloss,
Yes.
Vice Chair Anderson,
Yes,
Board Member Garfeiti,
Yes.
Board Member Lewis,
Yes.
Board Member Sherry.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you. May I make a comment? On behalf of Jim Firth is here. He's a senior pastor of a church here in Santa Barbara, and they've been renting for the last 21 years. 21 years, and so this is just a major win. And so on behalf of his family, we just want to thank you for this approval. Really
Well,
appreciate it.
congratulations, you have a home.
thank you, yes.
That's great.
Thank you so much.
Chair
Have a good day.
Kloss, if you could announce the appeal period.
Yeah, there is a 10-day appeal period from today's decision, and so hopefully you won't hear from anybody, but staff will notify you if there is an appeal filed.
Great.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Board members, do we need a break before we begin our training, or would we like to jump in? Good?
Okay, so we'll move on to item 3, which is board member training and discussions. And we have staff member Ted Hamilton, who will help walk us. Ted's going to train us.
Probably run out. We do, but I think we usually wait until it's like almost over. Yeah. Yes. Right on time.
Good afternoon, Chair Clausen, board members. Nice to see you again. Ted Hamilton Roll. I'll be presenting today's training and discussion. This is the second of 3 planned sessions. Today, we're going to talk about how to evaluate neighborhood compatibility using the design guidelines. And in session 3, we're going to go over 2-story concepts and Florida lot area ratio, or FAR. And then at the end of the discussion today, we'll take public comment. And if there are any other training topics you'd like us to consider doing, please have those in mind as well. As the framework for this discussion, I'd like you to be thinking about these 2 questions on the slide. You don't have to answer them now, but just be thinking about them as we go along. So first is, how are SFDB's design guidelines working for you in general? And second, what additional tools or guidance would help you to evaluate neighborhood compatibility? In order to, well, let's begin by defining what we mean by design guidelines. And to understand what design guidelines are, it might be helpful to understand what they're not. They aren't code requirements, laws, or prohibitions of any unique and inventive design solutions. They are tools for applicants primarily to help applicants design projects that are compatible with the surrounding neighborhood, preserve visual resources, and promote sustainability. And the guidelines help homeowners and applicants design projects that are compatible with the neighborhood, both in size and design. And lastly, the guidelines are a framework for decision makers. They provide a foundation for the design review process and decision makers to rely on when evaluating projects. Some cities don't even have discretionary design review boards. Santa Barbara enjoys the benefits of having boards that review projects for compatibility with the neighborhood, and boards like SFDB rely on guidelines to do their job. So to further define what a guideline is, it's helpful to compare an example of a subjective guideline with an objective standard. So on the left, we have a standard from the municipal code. It's a shall statement, and it says maximum height is 30 feet for single-family homes in single-unit residential zones. On the right, we have a subjective guideline, or a may or should statement, and it says avoid excessive building height. Homes taller than 25 feet are usually incompatible in most single-family neighborhoods. So you see the example on the left is more of a requirement. The example on the right, the guidelines are encouraging or discouraging a certain thing. So what guidelines apply to SFDB review? Well, there are 6 sets. The 2 most common that you're going to be using are these 2. So the Single Family Design Board General Design Guidelines and the Single Family Residence Design Guidelines. And we're going to be focusing on the latter primarily for this training. So the other ones that apply are Fence, Wall, Screen, and Hedge Guidelines, Outdoor Lighting Design Guidelines, Lower Riviera Guidelines, and the Historic Resource Design Guidelines. I'd like to note there is a really specific situation in which the Historic Resource Guidelines would come into play, and that's if you have new construction proposed next to an existing historic resource. In that case, the architectural historian with the city would get involved ahead of time before the project gets to you, and we'd offer guidance on how to evaluate consistency with the historic resource. So we can come back to this slide later if there are any questions about how all these interrelate to each other. SFDB's charge is to use the applicable guidelines to make findings that projects are compatible with the neighborhood. In their discussion of neighborhood compatibility, the guidelines address each of the project elements listed on this page. We're going to focus on the top 6 that are in bold. So defining a neighborhood, volume, mass, bulk, scale, height, architectural style, roof materials, and fences, walls, and hedges. At the next training, we're going to focus on FAR and 2-story concepts. And I'll note that some of these are more straightforward than others, which is why we kind of split them up into these different sessions here. I'd also like to address a common misconception, and that is that compatibility equals sameness and that in order to be compatible with the neighborhood, a development must match the neighborhood exactly. This is not the case. It's why we have discretionary review boards instead of objective design standards for all projects. New development can be distinct from existing development and also be compatible with it. This was something that we heard consistently from our outreach with focus groups and our survey with our general SFDB process improvement effort. So here are some examples of what the city is trying to avoid by having design review. Obviously, these are extreme examples, and the point is that your role as a board is to promote an aesthetically pleasing built environment and avoid these kind of egregious or flat, boring examples like the ones shown here. We have an emoji house on the top left. Top right is an addition that's just been plunked onto the top of the roof. We have a walled-off house on the left bottom, and obviously that on the bottom right. And although this board probably won't see any upside-down houses proposed, that doesn't mean that every project has to be exemplary, top tier, the best it can be. You're going to see a wide variation in the quality of projects for a variety of reasons. You've got owners with different levels of resources. Therefore, it's helpful to think about project quality along a spectrum of compatibility, which is what's shown here, from least compatible to most compatible. And to evaluate a project's neighborhood compatibility along a spectrum, you look at the big picture, consider the overall aesthetic from the street, how the project relates to the other homes in the neighborhood, the development pattern in general, and smaller details like window treatments, roof lines, and overall massing. So take all these elements together, ask yourself, what's within the spectrum of acceptability within the neighborhood that you're looking at? Obviously, it would be great if all projects were exemplary, and Santa Barbara is known for its great architecture. However, the difference in time and money between a compatible project and an exemplary project can be vast. So the difference between compatible and exemplary shown there, kind of a range. Therefore, we ask that the board take a cautious approach when asking for design changes. If the change isn't necessary to make the project compatible and kind of cross that threshold into acceptability, then consider making it a suggestion rather than a requirement for approval. In order to understand how to evaluate neighborhood compatibility, it's essential, of course, to understand how to define a neighborhood. And that task is up to the board. The guidelines don't include a hard and fast definition of what a neighborhood is. Rather, they provide a formula to help you understand add a definition on a project-by-project basis. On the left, we have a general plan neighborhood map, and general plan neighborhoods are defined as such for the purpose of long-range planning and policymaking. These are generally too broad for SFDB's purposes because within one of these general plan neighborhoods, you would have multiple zoning designations, you'd have multiple types of uses and architecture sizes and scales. So it's important to drill down further into the immediate neighborhood, which, showing on my cursor, could be illustrated by this hypothetical area in Eucalyptus Hill. So this immediate neighborhood is defined, or some of the characteristics of an immediate neighborhood are that it's walkable within about 15 minutes. It's all the same zoning. It's a similar pattern of development in terms of structures and landscaping. And you've got main roads and railroads and bridges, big landmarks like that as the boundaries of it. To drill down even further, you could use the 20 closest homes example, which is illustrated in this blue shading here. This gets out what's on the street adjacent to and immediately across from your subject property. So as we approach our discussion at the end, I'd like you to be thinking about how this model here is working for you in terms of defining a neighborhood. The most important thing to think about when you're reviewing neighborhood compatibility is size, bulk, and scale. Now, I don't want to belabor how to define those things mostly in a room full of architects, but I do want to show how we apply those concepts to single-family homes. So the house on the left would generally be compatible in terms of size, bulk, and scale with most neighborhoods in Santa Barbara. The massing is broken up. It's a second story, but the second story is set back and it's not a full second story. Also, the entry and all the windows openings are at the human scale, and it feels very approachable and convivial from the street. The house on the right, in contrast, is set up on a pedestal, and its scale feels more intimidating, not as approachable. It's got that grand entryway and large windows and doors, and it's also a solid two-story mass, so it wouldn't generally be compatible with most neighborhoods in Santa Barbara in terms of size, bulk, and scale. And since size, bulk, and scale are so important, let's take a moment to apply them to the Neighborhood Preservation Ordinance Finding B for compatibility. The guidelines state that areas of maximum height should be minimized. Taller portions of buildings should be set back to reduce the apparent height. And architectural features should be used to break up bulk. So the upper example doesn't exactly follow those guidelines. We're looking, of course, at the house in the middle. Again, it's a two-story solid mass, kind of like the previous example, the house on the right. It's got a blank wall right here. There's really no architectural features that are breaking it up. So it would be pretty difficult to make the compatibility finding B for this project. If we look at the example below, the massing is broken up. You've got architectural features like a Juliet balcony and a chimney that help break up the mass. And it's also a similar height to the house on the left. So it'd be easier to make the compatibility finding for this house. And I also want to note that for the upper house, even though it is about the same height as its neighbor on the left, it does appear a lot larger just due to that solid mass of the second story. So speaking of building height, homes in single-unit residential zones, as I said earlier, are allowed to go up to 30 feet in height per the zoning ordinance. However, the guidelines indicate that homes taller than 25 feet are generally not compatible with most neighborhoods. So generally, the houses that are taller than 25 feet are located in the Hillside Design District, where they're trying to work with the lot slope and kind of get the most out of their available buildable area. So an example of a hillside house is here. You can see the 30-foot line is right here, and it's measured from the existing or finished grade, whichever's lower, to a point 30 feet in the air. And you can see this house meets that guideline, or meets that code requirement, rather. In this image, you have two houses, both of which presumably meet that height limit of 30 feet, but one of them is more compatible in terms of the guidelines than the other. The house on the top here is set in nicely to the hill. It's got slightly lower plate heights, and it appears to be approximately the same scale generally as its neighbor to the right. In contrast, the house below has taller plate heights. It has a basement story that increases its overall apparent height. So this one is a little bit less compatible with the guidelines in terms of, or compatible with the neighborhood if you look at the guidelines. And speaking of height, in our outreach to applicants and board members, we heard from a lot of folks that there tended to be an over-reliance by the board on plate height. So I would ask you to consider plate height within the context of overall height, and remember that it's just one tool you have available to address height and size, bulk, and scale. So on the left, we have a house with a 10-foot and a 9-foot plate height, 10 foot on the first story, 9-foot second story. And on the right, we have a house with 8-foot plate heights, first and second story. The house on the left and right, they're both about the same overall height, and they could both potentially be compatible with the neighborhood, even though the house on the left has taller plate heights. So it's a matter of context. And, you know, in addition, if you have a house that's really far away from the neighbors, not visible from the public, then taller plate heights can be okay. The point is that use plate height just as one tool that you've got, kind of like FAR, which we'll cover later. The city does not mandate architectural style for SFDB projects, and the guidelines don't say that a project has to match a particular architectural style within a neighborhood, but rather the project's elements should be consistent with the best elements that distinguish the neighborhood where the project is. Those elements are shown here below. They include size, scale, roof lines, materials, the general maintenance of existing development patterns, trims, window treatments, things like that. So to evaluate style within the guidelines, we're asking our boards to put aside personal preferences and use these project elements to evaluate the compatibility of a project and avoid a discordant or clashing appearance with the neighborhood. I will acknowledge, other than this guidance, kind of on this page and in the guidelines, there may be like 2 pages. There's not a whole lot of information in the guidelines about how to determine if a certain architectural style is compatible. That's where we rely on your expertise as architects and board members, and it leaves it pretty open to interpretation. But again, we just ask you to use these elements that the guidelines mentions as the metrics to gauge style. Another important aspect is roof materials, and speaking of style, the guidelines really only talk about roof materials within the context of the Spanish colonial revival style. Unfortunately, it doesn't help your review when you have a more modern style, really any other style than Spanish colonial. I'll note that the code says shiny reflective roof materials are not allowed, so staff will probably stop any of those before they get to you, but just keep that in mind. That's not allowed per code. And the guidelines say that the main thing to keep in mind when you're looking at roof material is to ensure that it's consistent with the architectural style of the residence. So given all that, the board should be sensitive to a property that has a specific style and ensure that the roof material is in keeping with that, especially for Mission and Spanish colonial revival houses, since the guidelines are fairly specific about those. However, with other architectural styles, you have more leeway in considering other types of roof materials, and that includes standing seam metal, comp shingle, others. And in our focus group outreach, there was a desire for the board to be a little bit more accepting of other roofing materials, including standing seam. The city's intent is not to wall off its neighborhoods with tall fences and hedges and walls. Instead, we want to make the neighborhoods pedestrian friendly, and we want to see the neighborhood's houses that you spend so much time reviewing. The example here shows 2 adjacent residences. The one on the left is almost completely walled off from public view by these hedges. And the one on the right has a low picket fence that allows you to see the house from the street. The guidelines I wasn't sure if that was my mic or not. Sounds like it wasn't. As I was saying, the guidelines encourage the style of development on the right with the low picket fence that allows you to see the house, and discourage the type of development on the left where you've got completely walled off house. The Good Neighbor Guidelines, which we'll address momentarily, talk about how to encourage interior lot line fences and hedges to be sensitive to neighbors' privacy and views. One really provocative thought we heard during our outreach as part of the SFDB process improvement effort was that project visibility project compatibility rather, is a function of visibility. So when considering all the project elements we've talked about, does SFDB need to ask applicants to modify their plans if the design isn't affecting anyone? For example, the development on the left is highly visible to the public, and all the public can see of the development on the right is the fence and some landscaping. So we'll unpack this idea in our discussion, but something to kind of ponder for a minute. And in addition to project visibility to the public, designing projects in consideration of the neighbors is increasingly important as our neighborhoods become more dense. To that end, I'd like to touch on the Good Neighbor Guidelines and tips. The purpose of these guidelines is generally to help homeowners design their addition or new house as if they're going to be living next to it. Based on the golden rule, treat others how you want to be treated. And there are 4 topics covered by these guidelines, and they are privacy, landscaping, noise, and lighting. This example shows how a proposed spa can be cited to be consistent with the Good Neighbor Guidelines for privacy, noise, landscaping, and lighting. And on the top, you can see the spa is kind of plunked down right there in the middle of the hill. That presents an obvious sightline issue between the spa, the people in the spa, and the neighboring house. So this is really not ideal from a privacy standpoint here, potentially a noise standpoint. The version on the bottom here shows the spa cut into the hillside, which could help from a noise standpoint. It also shows a tree or hedges screening the spa from the neighbors. So this is beneficial in terms of privacy. Imagine you have a light fixture on the upper house that's shining right toward the property line. This is discouraged in the guidelines, and I think it's actually a code. It's not allowed per the code to just have a fixture shining toward the property line. Instead, the guidelines in the code would have you downlight and only illuminate the area that needs to be lit up, like this deck here. So in general, the lower example is a lot more consistent with the Good Neighbor Guidelines than the upper example. This is an interesting factoid from our process improvement data crunching from our survey. The Good Neighbor Guidelines encourage homeowners to talk to their neighbors about their development projects. And in our survey, about half of the respondents reported that they shared project plans with neighbors. We'd like to see this number increase, especially for applicants who are building a large addition or a new house. Regardless of whether the project required a mail notice from the city, the guidelines really encourage neighbors to just talk to each other about their projects. And this is the last slide, then we'll get into our discussion. As I mentioned in the first training session, members of the public are going to come to you with all kinds of things that are not within your purview, and one of those things that comes up a lot is private views. So I'd like to address how to handle that topic. The only way to formally protect a private view is through a view easement, and the city is not a party to that. The SFDB has no role in that. This is a civil matter, and it's best if property owners work with each other ahead of time to make sure that they're minimizing the chances of impacting each other's views. The Good Neighbor Guidelines handout has a long list of tips to help neighbors engage with each other to talk about projects. Some of those are listed here. And I should note these tips, the Good Neighbor tips, are not associated with any of SFDB's required findings to approve a project. So that means they're only meant as tools for applicants to use. The SFDB doesn't have to rely on them to make any findings. Last thing to note, addressing views, there are some situations in which public views are going to come up, and public views are very much in SFDB's purview. And staff will let you know if there are any specific protected view corridors that you need to be mindful of.
We have a question to ask. We have an opportunity to ask questions at the end, or should we do that as we go along?
You will have an opportunity right now. We're in our discussion.
Excellent.
So I'll kick it off just by asking, first of all, any questions about what we just talked about, and then we can go through the rest of these.
I have a question about public views. So can you explain to our board how public views are defined? Is a pedestrian walking along a public street up on the Riviera who's trying to look down on the city, is that a public view?
There are, I guess, a couple of grades of public views or sort of levels to think about. One is a formally protected view corridor by either the city or by the state. There are only really a couple of those in the city. One, I don't know them off the top of my head exactly, but one of them is along Shoreline. It's sort of the coastal view. And specific view corridors also exist along, there's a street, I believe it might be Sola. Anyway, there are protected views by code and by state law. So we'll let you know if those apply. And to answer your question about whether just generally looking from a street onto a property is considered a public view, the answer is yes. However, when you're looking at views, think about kind of the broader impact of the development proposed. Is it going to affect a potentially significant large number of people or residences? Like if you have a really large development proposed on the hillside, is that going to, impact potentially public views of the mountains and create, if you've got a ridge line, for example, and you've got sort of a spike coming up off that ridge line, that's what the guidelines are trying to get at when protecting hillside views. That's the hillside design findings. Any other questions about the presentation? Anything in there? Okay. So in addition to the guidelines and what I've just covered, are there any additional tools that would help you evaluate compatibility? And I ask that question keeping in mind that we'll have a specific discussion on FAR and those specific tools for two-story and projects that apply, or projects where FAR applies.
The question I have is that if something, since the design guidelines are not strict rules, they're not code, but if they're very clearly against the prescribed guidelines here, how do we then find neighborhood findings? Or then we make a judgment call on how far in that gradient we feel it sits? Is that more? And then through the average of the five of us, we place whether that gets approved or not. Is that kind of the idea?
So let me make sure I understand the question. So if you're all kind of coming to an agreement on whether a project is acceptable or not.
Let's say maybe we're not, but there's
Okay.
a item that is not following a design guideline that's
Sure.
quite clear. Is it then just simply between all of us, the kind of checks and balances is the fact that there can be disagreement, it falls in that gradient. But yeah, how far should the guidelines that are written in this be impacting the neighborhood compatibility findings then?
That's a good question. And a good approach when thinking about the guidelines is that they aren't binding. Even if a project doesn't meet the guidelines, the board can still approve it. And there could be any number of reasons why a project doesn't meet guidelines. It could be something with the way the site is designed. It could be constraints on the site. It could be, any number of things. That's the only one I could think of off the top of my head. But yeah, if there is concern, especially if the public has brought up a concern that a project isn't meeting a guideline, I think it would be good for the board to try to address that and say why they think that guideline either doesn't apply to the project or other guidelines kind of supersede it as being more important.
So we would want to include that in our motion or our findings that are
If
part of
it's-
the motion.
If it's something specific that comes up in the hearing, then yes.
Okay. I had an example of that on consent last time where there was a deck. Normally, we would look at it, you'd look at it in site plan or floor plan, you just go, no way, too close to lot line, whatever. Well, in this case, it happened to be down here as opposed to the neighbor who was up here. So there was no way this project was going to be creating a privacy issue for this neighbor. So completely contrary to guidelines, but in that particular case, because of topography, it was easy to make that decision. So that's a really simple case of, I think, what Mr. Hamilton's trying to articulate.
And just to add to that, you as the board and staff are really the experts on the guidelines. So I would say there probably aren't a whole lot of members of the public that know them inside and out, all 130 pages or however many there are. So really, use your discretion and use your judgment when evaluating how guidelines apply.
You were asking what, so item 2 is what additional tools would help us evaluate compatibility. So I know one of the things that's come up is the gross versus net square footage comparison. I think that would be important.
That is important. That's a really,
And I know it's
we'll
a
get into that.
difficult one.
We'll get into that when
Yeah.
we talk about FAR in our next training
Okay.
in more detail. But for now, the way that the building code defines floor area is gross. The way that planning defines or measures floor area is net. And for any members of the public that might be listening, net is you measure the floor from the inside of the walls, and gross floor area is you measure the floor area from the outside of the walls. So net tends to be a slightly lower number. But that is a good question. We'd like to discuss that with the board at our next training and determine, is the 20 closest lots study really working as a metric? To what extent is it comparing apples to oranges? Is there any way we could improve it? So that's coming. We'll have a more formal discussion on that later.
Does anybody else have any ideas about item 2? Because this seems like this is kind of at the core of a lot of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think one thing that could be helpful is adjacent home heights. I think sometimes we're able to just see the house next to it in their photo, but especially when they're wanting to significantly alter the scale of the building, it's helpful to see enough other buildings on their street and other residences and compare those heights to know how close off. Or same with your example where you had the different plate heights, being able to see that. And it's one thing if like the entire street is at 8 feet and now you're proposing 12 feet, really part of it is a study for us to really understand the street that they're on, but also as a checks and balance for the architect or the design team and the owner to really understand the context in which their house sits.
That's a great suggestion. We've heard in our outreach, both to you board members and also to applicants, that street silhouettes tend to be pretty effective at just gauging how a development is going to fit in. I mean, in my previous slide, with that example of the house on the bottom and the house on the top, that's a street silhouette example. So that could be a good way to do it. I'm wondering if there's a simpler way that maybe wouldn't cost so much for architects to produce.
Well, I think even taking photos where they're like straight on, and you create a little panorama, that is very easy, and then you just put in your elevation there to scale as best as possible, rather than knowing for certain, the house next to me is 25 feet and I'm 20.
Right.
You're not going out there to measure, but that way it's close enough, at least at the beginning, as a preliminary thing.
So not necessarily having the number, maybe not knowing whether the house on the left is 27 feet and the next one's 28, but having like a visual study. Okay, that's a good suggestion. And we can come back to that idea. So, and even if you think of something, tomorrow or whenever, just feel free to send us an email and we can field that. Let's move on to question 3. What considerations are important to you in defining a neighborhood? So going back to that general plan versus immediate versus 20 closest homes. Is that working? Is there a different way that you might like to do this? And also, you can also consider asking the applicant or the homeowner to help define the neighborhood and use that to inform your decision.
I think that decision needs to remain with our board. For obvious reasons. Considerations the considerations I give to that are, I think, outlined in our guidelines, but sometimes we have cul-de-sacs and smaller areas where these homes exist. There's small developments up on the Riviera and other areas in town where maybe there's only 6 houses on that particular cul-de-sac. So when we start looking at the neighborhood, we might be looking at those 6 homes, but we might also be considering the ones that are, maybe they're even across I'll call it a valley,
A
right?
canyon, right.
Yeah, so if there's a visual connection, that to me starts speaking to compatibility, or maybe it's the homes below it or above it. So I think it has to do, getting back to that slide of, if you can't see it, right, then is there a compatibility aspect? But if you can see it, then that starts talking to compatibility more from a neighborhood standpoint. And I also think in those cases, it really is about the sequence of arrival to the home in many cases. So, and then sometimes we get into the question of, well, there's 3 ways to get to that home. So then it becomes, is it maybe the most traveled approach to that particular enclave? These are the things that I try to think of when defining neighborhood. I don't know if anybody else has any ideas about that.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think you've done a good job of calling out recently where there may be special cases where we wouldn't look at the 20 closest homes. I think it is helpful for applicants to have initially a clear idea so that if they do come to us with a study, it's not them just handpicking houses. Like, I think it's good to have a starting point that's clear if possible, again, just for the applicant team, so that otherwise if we don't, then it can kind of open things up. It is frustrating if they come to us and then, we decide back, actually, this is a really unique circumstance. And I know we've had that recently too, where just the size of the lot or the orientation on the street that it's on. So I'm sure there are cases where we're going to have to go back and maybe alter that, but I think it'd probably benefit the public the most to have a starting point that's clear so that they can come to that first meeting if they need to, especially if there's any sort of FAR requirement or situation where they need to provide us with those calculations.
One thing I'd list as optional in that is that if you know that your house or property is significantly different in some way, that totally optional, but it would be beneficial to come to the board with an understanding of what other properties are somewhat similar to that, I think always helps us and is usually like the next step for them. So it could help expedite that process for them. So if their lot is double the size, well, what other ones around that area and what does that look like? Or, I don't know, any other kind of obscurity to their particular lot, if there are others similar to them in somewhat near of a vicinity, I think is something we will immediately ask for.
So one of the things that I find challenging is that oftentimes, and this is, so if I put the architect hat on versus the design reviewer hat, as the architect, I'm going to want to make the argument for whatever it is that I am proposing to the board. So there is a propensity or a desire to perhaps go beyond that neighborhood and start cherry picking things out of, I'll call it the vicinity, which might be broader than the neighborhood, in order to support my argument. And I can understand the desire on applicants' parts to do that. I think that muddies the waters, and so I do think what Ms. Grafiti is saying is important, that neighborhood get identified early so that the applicants clearly understand what we as a board are looking at from a comparative standpoint or compatibility standpoint. And as a reviewer, I'll just be very frank, I don't want to see the other stuff, because it just starts muddying the water and it starts creating more conversation than I think we need to have in this venue. And so the degree to which we can narrow that and be very clear about that at the outset, I think would help expedite and set expectations clearly.
But a lot of times, the applicant comes to us and just offers it as part of their first presentation, and we haven't necessarily told them what we think the neighborhood is. So they can say what they want, and then we can agree or not agree with it. But the only way around that is to define the neighborhood before they submit an application. So, which I think is difficult to do. But I had one question, Ted, about this 20 closest homes study, because I know that we've asked for it a lot, and they don't show up with it. And it does say in the guidelines, when a project exceeds 75%, the applicant must provide a study of the FAR of the 20 closest homes. But we haven't been getting those. So are they supposed to do it and then just show up? And why are these projects getting past us without it? And why do we have to ask it? Because in this case today for Kevin's project is, if staff had caught that and it was something that was supposed to be provided, he might not have had to come back with it. And it might have moved his project forward quicker. So are we going to require it per this book? Because you said this is the book, this is our Bible, right? Or are we not? Is it, sometimes it's a tool, like the planner, I forgot her name. Yeah, Barbara. So when she said it's a tool, and then I went back and read that it's a requirement. So I think it has to be.
In that case, there might have been confusion because of the FAR calculation problem that occurred on that particular project.
Yeah.
But I understand
Right.
exactly what you're saying, that if we are above that threshold, that we should just be getting it, period.
Because
And we
if
shouldn't
we're
have
always
to
going to ask for it, which we normally ask, and likewise, if we're going to always ask the applicant if they talk to their neighbor, then, I'm putting my architect hat on. I'm not going to necessarily talk to the neighbor if I don't have a controversial project, or I don't think I have a controversial project. There's no need to talk to the neighbor. So are we gonna, used to be where we required it. There was a time when you were required to go door to door and talk to everybody. And now that seems to have gone the wayside, so it's another thing that would, if we're gonna ask for it every time, then maybe it's something that should be, I hate to say it should be required. I really don't think that people should have to talk to their neighbors but it's, we should encourage them to, like you say.
Thanks for that question. That's a really great one, and I'll take a stab at answering it today, and I think we'll be able to cover it in more detail at the next hearing or the next training and talk about, are these resources useful? But to get to the crux of it, the guidelines state that the 20 closest lots, basically the FAR supplemental application, is required unless waived by SFDB. So that's what the guidelines say, and that leaves room for basically one concept review where the applicant doesn't have those materials. The guidelines aren't perfect. I think that does present an issue with streamlining. We need to be able to condense the hearings, and I would say staff is pretty good at noticing when projects are at that 85% threshold and requiring that up front for applications when we see it, when it's shown on the plans. But there are times when we receive plans for concept review that don't have that information. So we're not able to tell if the FAR supplemental application is actually needed until we get further along the line and have plan check comments. But that is a good consideration to think about. When should a project come to the board? Is it after that initial plan check and you've gotten all zoning comments back that would indicate that the FAR is 85 and go from there, or should it be earlier on or at the really conceptual phase?
Well, I think it's
That's
more
one
important. I
consideration.
think it's more important I think it would be great if staff could feel it out, because there are, I just had a project approved that was over 85%, but it was not even really in a neighborhood. It was on Gibraltar Road. And it wasn't necessary. It would have been really difficult and time consuming for me to have to do it, and it really wasn't appropriate. So I do agree that there are times when it's not appropriate. So it'd be great if staff could kind of assess it and go, oh yeah, this is one on the Mesa, or this is in a neighborhood that is closer home, smaller lots, when the 85% has more of an effect. And so I don't know.
Yeah, so that might be something, I'm wondering if in certain situations like that where staff is on the fence, if that could be if one or more of us on the board could provide a liaison to staff in that way, where staff could check in and say, hey, look, this one's over 85%, but it's in the middle of Timbuktu. You can't see it from anywhere. Do you really think that we need that here? And then whomever that is that plays that role could inform the board of that decision when the item comes before us.
I think in general, staff would love to have more of a dialogue in the application intake and processing phase with board members. And we do reach out to board members to just get a sense of, hey, is this, do you think this is appropriate to admin? Do you think this is, needs full board review, that kind of thing. So we'll keep that in mind. And I'd also like to address quickly that we should only be using the 20 closest lots example for projects with required FAR. That's projects that are 2-story on a lot 15,000 feet or greater. So in general, those properties in...
No, wait a minute, 15,000 square feet or less,
Oh,
right?
excuse me, less,
Okay.
yeah. Those lots that are 15,000 square feet or greater, guideline FAR applies, and essentially it's a non-issue. It's just another tool that the board has to use to look at size, bulk, and scale.
Starting to go down the more FAR route, so I have questions, but I think it's best to hold them, yeah.
I would say ask them, and then, because that'll help me prepare for the next training, and if it's something that can't be answered now, then we'll get to it next time.
Well, I do think it's good to cover recommended versus required. I have seen us ask some of the things that are required FAR to recommended FARs. And so I think us as a board having more of an opinion or being more clear about what we would require or want versus not, because again, a lot of the materials that aren't required for some of these FARs that are on recommended, like larger lots, we're still asking for a lot of those materials, so.
I think that's a good point. I think that gets back to visibility in a lot of cases. I'm thinking of a recent project that we had, and it was up in the Cielito area. I think it was a very large parcel, 10 acres, something of that nature. The house was in the middle of the parcel, so it's clearly over the 15,000. But there's many properties up on the Riviera that exceed 15,000 square feet, some on the Mesa, and they are clearly visible. So this is part of the difficulty of the beautiful town that we live in that undulates topographically and geographically. And so how do we, but in my mind, it does get back to that visibility and that connectivity from a visual standpoint.
Yeah, to answer number 4, I think it to a huge extent, compatibility is a function of visibility. And especially when, it's always an issue when I hear suggestions made to applicants that are dictating what kind of pavers they're using in their backyard. And I just,
Like no one's going to see
what?
Like no one's going to see those.
Like no one's going to see it. And then, but it's still, it's the board's purview technically. But, then we have to ask ourselves, God, do we really need to talk about this? And then that's something that we all have to judge as we go through the hearings and what we bring up.
One important balance point to keep in mind as a board member is you have a lot of, skills and you're experts in what you're doing. And you might have a really good design solution for somebody, say a backyard paver. And if they're proposing something that you think is could be really improved, but nobody's going to see, that's when you should be saying, okay, well, I'm not going to require this, but think about changing out your pavers for something else because you would have X, Y, and Z benefits, right? So you can always make those suggestions, but steer, if it's not visible, if it's not really going to matter to making the findings, then I would say either avoid it as a topic of conversation or just make it a recommendation or suggestion.
It's not really a question. I just keep going back to, the overarching, neighborhood compatibility issue that we're dealing with is transforming neighborhoods because everyone wants to maximize density. So having a bigger picture like planning department or city, we're heading in this direction and 100% is where we're going to be in the next year, and then we're going to be 125, and that's acceptable to us would help me. And then the whole ADU conversation, and I know that's not under our purview, but architecturally compatible, just, for me, my neighborhoods, I see are transformed and not in a good way. So further feedback on the ADUs and where the city is headed would be super valuable,
From
I
an
think.
FAR standpoint.
Well, yeah, it's a tool, but a good tool with everybody coming in with, 125%. 9 projects out of 10 are that way. There's very few that are 75% now.
Yeah. I have sort of a rhetorical question that I'm asking myself in regards to this number 4, and I'd be interested in everybody else's thoughts about this. So I agree that compatibility is a function of visibility. It's a great catchphrase, and I don't know who came up with it, but I love it. So what happens when, God forbid, but it does happen, and we've lived through it many times here in Santa Barbara. We have some sort of cataclysmic event, whether that be a wildfire or a mudslide or whatever it is that comes in and changes what I'll call the natural form in our neighborhoods. So what happens when fire sweeps through an area and our firefighters, who are great locally, do their job and they protect structures in place, they survive, but now we have none of that greenery around for another 10 to 15 years that we as a board are sort of depending upon to ensure this lack of visibility and therefore no need to ensure compatibility. So it's kind of a question in my mind, and it's part of this whole hedge and privacy conversation that we're having. To what degree can we depend upon that? Because I think that item number 4 works in a context where we don't have that. But when we do have things that start affecting the large oaks or the, plethora of pittosporum and the podocarpus and the this and that sort of insulate these parcels that are typically larger, and that typically do have more landscaping. What happens when that falls away, but perhaps these structures remain, which are being built to be more resilient and that are now, sprinklered? We have, this is just a question I'm asking myself, and I'm wondering if anybody else has any thoughts about this.
I did think about this when I was preparing the presentation, so I do have something of an answer, but I'd be curious to hear board member opinions.
I think it's a really good question. I don't have an answer to it.
Yeah, I think the answer to is like sort of the hierarchy of that visibility, and ultimately the most important being the obviously public facing, but then also I think keeping in mind like the density of areas and the things that maybe will become visible versus like some properties we've had where even if vegetation goes around it, you're still so far in distance away, or maybe in an area. But yeah, I think it does start to create a hierarchy of what may potentially be important or not.
I think that's a great idea. The idea to sort of prioritize those different elements, whether it's vegetation or built form or non-flammable or whatever it might be, maybe that's a place to start. That's a great idea.
The idea of a hierarchy of those elements is a good one, and I think another way to think about it is the permanence of whatever elements you're looking at. For example, if you have a fence versus a hedge versus topography that's screening something, what happens if the fence goes away or the hedge goes away? You can see the house, obviously, but if you have topography, then that's a little harder to move unless you're doing a lot of grading, and there would probably be findings for that anyway. I should note also for the purposes of this question that if a house is destroyed as a result of a disaster like a fire, then the code allows it to be rebuilt as it was. So if there are any changes proposed to that design, though, those would come before the board. That's not necessarily an answer to the question, but just something to know and keep in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking of an extreme example, like, okay, there's the old, like, Montgomery War Estate up on the hill, and then like maybe down below it, let's say there's a big property that's developed with, a board form concrete, Robin Donaldson project or something. And so we've got like the neoclassical, then we've got like the spaceship landing. And so then what happens when there's no vegetation? It's like, okay, like, I don't know, is the spaceship coming in for landing at the Ward Estate? It just, all of a sudden, we're going to have some wacky conditions if that were to occur. So this is, yeah.
I think another way to think about it is as planners, we think about what can be anticipated, and we think about a project that's proposed in front of us at the moment. You do your best to think about potential implications of the project you're looking at down the line. But I would encourage you just to look at what's in front of you at the time and think about its sustainability for sure. But don't review a project just thinking about, oh, this hillside's going to burn in 20 years, and what do we need to do to make sure that the design of the house is fine when that happens? Well, it's 5:32. I don't want to keep you all night, but if there are any questions, any last questions, we can go over those. Also, if you think of anything, like I said, feel free to email me. Ms. Garson, do you have any questions or comments?
No, great presentation, Ted, and thank you for the board members for participating.
Thank you
We should
all.
go to public comment, though.
Yes, we should. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mariah.
I'll open up for public comment. We'll go ahead and start with in-person public comment. At this time, I haven't received any speaker slips. And I don't see anyone moving to speak, so I'll go ahead and move to virtual public comment. If you wish to speak on Zoom, you can raise your hand at this time, and I'll call on you. I don't see any hands raised on Zoom, and we did not receive any written correspondence for this item, so I'll turn it back over to you, Chair Klas.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Hamilton. These are always very informative, and they create a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? Substantial discussion. So very much appreciated. And will we get a copy of this presentation from you?
You will, however, not for a while. I'm going to basically just make a large one once I'm done, after
Okay.
we're done with the third one.
Great.
I'll combine everything so that you'll have it, including my notes, so,
Okay.
yeah, you'll have
super.
it.
Okay. Thank you very
Thank you all.
much for your time and all the efforts. We very much appreciate it. So with that, we will adjourn the Single Family Design Board meeting for July 17th, 2023. Have a good evening.